Is joining NATO on the horizon for Brazil under the new government of President Jair Bolsonaro? And what's the basis of Brazil's sudden desire to partner with the US and engage with key institutions of the West? And why did protectionism not work for Brazil? And where lies the real battlefield for freedom and liberty in the West? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Today we sit down with Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs Ernesto Araujo. We discuss his views on Brazil's partnership with the United States, its NATO ambitions, its role in Venezuela and approach to China, and how he sees the battle for Western civilization as a fundamentally internal one. Pleasure to speak with you.
Pleasure for me.
So, we just had a joint press conference by President Bolsonaro and President Trump. And one of the things I noticed them talking about was this new chapter in U.S.-Brazilian cooperation. And I'm wondering if you could kind of expand on that a little bit for us, for our viewers. I'm sure you're central to this effort.
No, thank you. Yes, we're very enthusiastic about the opportunity to be here and to come back to where we should have been for a long time, which is with a very strong partnership with the United States. That's the natural thing for Brazil to do if we want a more open economy, a more open society. We are an open society, as the United States is, with all our challenges. So Brazilians identify a lot with the U.S. Something that's natural for Brazilians because of the culture, the approach to liberty, to institutions, etc. And this natural connectivity was denied by Brazilian governments for a long time for ideological reasons. Everything that was natural in terms of Brazil and the U.S. coming together was kind of suffocated for the interest of, keeping those opportunities untapped in terms of the economy, defense, cooperation, security. It looked like any initiative was good until you had the United States as a partner. Then it became bad. So things were not judged by the quality, but by the fact that the U.S. was in or out of it. So, and now we are coming back, which was the tradition of Brazilian foreign policy until the beginning of the 20th century. Back then, the conception that the way for Brazil to become a big player in the world it was through a connection with the United States was very clear. And for maybe 3/4 of the 20th century, when the United States was Brazil's main economic partner and partner as a whole, was a time of incredible growth for Brazil. Brazil was the country that grew the most in the world, even more than Japan, in that stretch, basically from 1900 to 1975, more or less. Then wrong options, wrong partnerships. Not wrong, but other partnerships are good.
Sure.
This cornerstone, which should have been a partnership with the United States, was neglected. And as a coincidence or not, Brazil started to stagnate, and the economy started to not deliver jobs, not deliver growth, and also Brazilian society started to lose faith in its institutions, etc. So now we're trying to reconnect, and so this new era is, in a sense, coming back to a spontaneous feeling of Brazilians, of brotherhood with the United States, and that it is a partnership that really can deliver results.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. In this joint statement that came out right after the press conference, it was President Trump mentioned that Brazil will be a major non-NATO ally, but during the press conference he even suggested it may be a NATO ally. Yes. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, we're breaking many taboos and many ideas that limit our scope of action. So Brazil is a Western country. We have a different composition in our society. Our history is different, but every country has a different history. But the main pillar of our culture and society is the Western tradition, right? And the West has basically two institutions that give shape to it: NATO, the military side, and the OECD and the economic side.
Right.
So basically, what we're doing here is saying that Brazil wants to identify as a Western country, which means we want to get closer to NATO and closer to the OECD. We want to get into the OECD, and President Trump is supporting our bid for that, and also is supporting our desire to be closer to NATO. It would be a sign of a change in the geopolitical map, because NATO, of course, is a child of the 1940s and 1950s. But things have changed, and now you have, in our region, for example, in South America, challenges that didn't exist before, especially the challenge represented by Venezuela. We have to talk maybe a little bit about that, but we need to create the conditions for a permanently democratic region in South America. This is a clear option of Brazil and most of other South American countries. This is an aspect of that basically didn't exist before. This strong desire for democracy and liberty that has to take shape in South America. So, and especially for Brazil, we want to be an anchor of a region that is stable around democratic principles, around strong nations. Basically, what the Europeans got in the 50s through NATO, that sense of stability and that sense of belonging together in a sort of alliance. So, if you may say so, we think again, coming back to the point that some things are natural and were denied us by wrong options. NATO, maybe, or not NATO, but the Western Alliance needs a north-south axis. They have a west-east axis, United States, Europe, but why not with Brazil in the south?
Did you discuss any of this?
Yes, we did. Some people can consider that very bold. We think, well, it's bold, but it makes sense, because it's a question of how we see ourselves. For a long time, Brazilian foreign policy liked to see Brazil, as Brazil was not, but liked to see Brazil as a country that didn't have any connection to the Western Alliance, or that saw that as a very problematic, that was unsure of itself, that always thought that, any relationship with a country like the United States would mean that we are subservient, or that we are doing whatever is whatever the U.S. wants, and it's not totally not that, right? But that was the image that we like to make of ourselves, a wrong image. Now we want to really look at the mirror and say, no, what are we? Oh, we're a big country, a country that's proud of itself, a country that needs to assert itself in the world for freedom, for democracy, for those Western values, to come back to that point. So. That's what we really are. We changed the mirror. We used for a long time. We had a distorting mirror of Brazil that showed as an image that was not us. It was not Brazilian society. Right? Now we're basically trying to put us in front of a correct mirror. I mean, a mirror that gives us our real image. Oh no, that's what Brazil is. That's what Brazil is, and seeing ourselves as our correct image, we see that it's natural to, for example, to come closer to NATO and maybe joining NATO.
That's very interesting. And I also noticed you've agreed to forego the special status with the WTO. You know, it struck me when I look at the OECD and this, it's really kind of Brazil taking a position, we're going to stand on our own 2 feet, we're going to figure things out ourselves. Is that how you read it?
Yes, exactly. It's all part of the same reconnection with our identity, with our perception of ourselves as a big player, because we wanted to be a global player, but we wanted to also to be seen as a small country, a country that needs special treatment, and of course we have challenges that are different from other countries that are maybe more advanced, but this sort of differentiated treatment is totally outdated. It didn't deliver what it was supposed to deliver. Right? Because it was supposed to deliver development. And so the idea of being a developing country means that one day you'll develop, but it never happens. You want to stay developing forever. So it makes no sense. Okay, let's forget about it. Basically, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit. The concept of development is still important, but let's get rid of that sort of playing with words, and let's play with the reality. And the reality is that Brazil can be a big player, can sit at the table at the WTO with the United States, with Europe, with Japan, with others, in order to try to redesign the WTO according to the new reality of the economic world, according to our new reality. So, and if the concept of differentiated treatment was a barrier for that, we should get rid of it.
Very interesting. And actually, along these veins, last night, President Bolsonaro, on the Fox News interview, he mentioned that he's encouraging the U.S. to basically retain its current immigration policy, meaning, as I understand it, to mean to have a secure border.
Yes.
And something he said was really interesting. He said, to a large extent, we owe our democracy in the Southern Hemisphere to the United States. And I thought that was fascinating. If you agree with that, can you expand on that a little bit?
It's interesting. We were talking about this in the car today, coming back from the White House, or when we were. No, it was when we were entering the Arlington Cemetery.
Oh, okay.
And looking at very strong image of so many soldiers buried there. The president said that to us. We were together in the car. That he said, "Well, imagine what the world would be without the United States." Because of all the participation in all the world, the wars, the reconstruction of the world after the Second World War. And more than that, more than the purely military or economic dimension, there's the spiritual dimension. I think since the beginning of the Republic, since the 18th century, the United States has been an inspiration for self-reliance, for a nation that is built on values and at the same time on a strong national identity, but with freedom, with the famous pursuit of happiness, which is an amazing concept that is so often forgotten. So this is part of it. It's not only the question of which is, when you look at everything that is published, or not everything, but mainstream international relations papers and journals, they would basically analyze the world through security and the economy. And I think they failed to analyze that sort of spiritual, untouchable dimension. And maybe it's even more important because human beings naturally desire freedom. I'm kind of speaking like the Declaration of Independence, but people naturally desire freedom, and when they look at the world, so who's the champion of freedom? It's been the United States. We cannot deny that. You cannot put the United States together with other countries that didn't have the same role, just to say, oh, we have to treat everyone the same, and no, that's the reality. So again, I think we should come back a lot to that question of mainstream thought being concentrated on words and not looking at the reality. And political correctness is basically that. You just are concerned only about a game of a play with words and not about it. So the reality is that the United States is essential for freedom. And why can't you say that? And the president says things that are real. That's why people voted for him.
It's very fascinating. It's reminding me of your paper, Trump and the West, which was kind of, I think, played a role certainly in you playing your role today in the current administration. And I actually I'm very, very curious. You actually were in the Brazilian government previously in these much more, let's call it, socialist governments and so forth. How were you just kind of hiding as a conservative all along, or did you have an epiphany? How did things change for you that made you write this very, at the time, controversial, from what I understand, paper?
Yes. No, I'm a career official, so I had to work with, let's say, social democratic governments, socialist governments, and along the years. And for a long time, I found my place in trade negotiations because I thought it was an area where you could do something for the country, for growth, independently from, let's say, the current ideology, because trade tends to have a rationality of its own. And for some time, I confess that I believed in a sort of economic nationalism that was rather protectionist, because I think misled by things that I read. But no one is perfect, right? Maybe I did think that you needed some sort of protection of your markets to preserve policy space for the government to have development policies. That was basically the idea. And you needed economic agreements to basically protect your ability to do that. But what happened in Brazil is that that policy space was used for corruption.
I see.
Okay. And then I and other people started to realize, oh, come on, we're negotiating to keep this market closed, but it's closed not for the government to implement sound policies, but for basically so that we don't have external interference in a corrupt system that was basically channeling money from the productive economy into political parties and their members. Right? So that was part of how I started to open my eyes, like many people in Brazilian society. And also, more and more I had the feeling that this whole spiritual dimension was sorely lacking in foreign policy and whatever I did. And more and more I thought, well, what is the meaning of what we're doing here? And I'm someone who thinks that the spiritual dimension should not be only in the church. I mean, it's not Sunday morning that people are spiritual beings, not only Sunday morning, they're spiritual beings 24 hours a day and in whatever they do. So if you don't...
One would hope.
Yeah, exactly, one would hope. So if you don't take that sort of transcendental or vertical dimension, as I like to say, into your work, into what you do, in that case into diplomacy, it's a very poor way of living and of working. So again, I was saying in the press, when I say, in the Brazilian press, when I say things like that, people say, oh, you're a fanatic. So it's a crazy world. When you talk about God, you're a fanatic. I mean, anyway, but so I started to feel the desire for some sort of political project that would encompass those different dimensions, the dimension of economic rationality that I saw was lacking in that economic nationalist project, right. And the sort of this dimension of inspirational, an inspirational dimension to our work. And suddenly Bolsonaro was there, and there was this ship where you could jump into, because for Brazilians who had this who had a more conservative leaning, you didn't have any political option in Brazil for a long time.
Right, like so, it's 6 years ago was the first conservative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that didn't exist. So you kind of okay, let's do with what we have. But then suddenly you said, oh, there's a viable political project. Which, by the way, when I started to write about that, Bolsonaro was polling kind of 6% in the election poll. So yeah, but
so it wasn't to get the job, as some people have said. I've noticed.
No. I was enthusiastic because it was different, and it was at the same time connecting to real people, to working people, and also igniting an atmosphere of this spiritual dimension, because it was a man who talked about God, who talked about his faith openly and in the public space. So I was enthusiastic about it. At the same time, of course, the Trump phenomenon here, which was a game changer for people who had that desire for something different in politics and international politics. This was essential, and so the first vehicle, I think, of those thoughts was evidently Trump and his electoral victory. And I was very much taken by what it meant for the world, what it meant for coming back to the nation as the cornerstone of social life, what it meant for this combination of let's say conservative values with an open economy, which is totally misconceived as being against globalization. It's not. It's just conceiving that globalization has a soul, and that the economy must have a soul because people have souls.
Very interesting.
So Trump in the world, new opening, new avenues, and Bolsonaro in Brazil showing that you had a way of going forward in Brazil as well.
I have to do this because I have this quote that I pulled from that paper that you wrote. I'll just read it, and I want to ask you a question. You wrote, "The enemy of the West," and this is thanks to the Center for Security Policy, who translated it very well. But the enemy of the West is not Russia or China, nor is it an enemy state, but indeed primarily an enemy within, abandoning one's own identity, and an outside enemy, radical Islamism, which meanwhile plays second fiddle to the first, because Islamism only poses a threat because it finds the West spiritually weak and disconnected from itself. There's no us versus them logic here, contrary to what Trump's detractors are fond of saying. There is instead an us seeking to reclaim ourselves logic. And I guess I want to find out more, how is that process? Do you believe that's actually happening in America now? And do you believe that's happening in Brazil? And
I think it is. Of course, in the US, I have the impression that the political climate is so corrosive that maybe part of that impulse has been not lost, but has been kind of put in weight. I mean, it happens normally in political movements that.
So Brazil's not that corrosive, as is.
It is too.
Oh, okay.
It is too. Maybe a little bit less, but we're still in a more initial phase where we still think that we can, let's say, preserve that. I think here in the U.S., Trump and his movement, President Trump and his, not necessarily the Republican Party, but the movement around Trump. They still retain the main axis of that sort of approach, but maybe it has been so challenged that it's hard to see, and people tend to see more the criticism. In Brazil, it's very early in the process, but we are already having that sort of challenge. And I started the sentence by trying to say that it was different, but it's very similar, actually. Well, now that I think of it, I realize. I think it's very similar. The inertia would take us to a road of normalization and coming back to political correctness and coming back to a technocratic approach to government. It's hard. You have to fight every day to keep ideas floating and to keep that disposition, that commitment to break that kind of limiting, suffocating thought system, because it's hard to break thought systems. Very hard. If you leave it to itself, things will kind of reconnect the old way. Right? I think that's what happens. So it's very tiresome. It's only 2.5 months into the government. It's tiresome. You have to, and we are. I'm not tired. It is tiresome, but and we're going to fight as long as we can. And I think we will win. I think this movement here will win by changing, bringing people's perception back to where they should be, which is that the nation makes sense, for example, and that conservative values are needed for a liberal economy. But it's an uphill battle.
Sure. It is. But you mentioned the word soul repeatedly as we've been speaking, and so it's really kind of reclaiming the soul of the nation. That's what you're saying.
It is. It is, exactly. So I see that as a kind of universal challenge, to see that. To see the world not as a battle between different countries, but as a battle between different ideas, different conception of the human being. And those are reflected differently in different countries, and some countries champion more some values, others champion other values. But to see the world as a competition, traditional big power competition between the US and China, or Russia, or Europe, or whatever, is wrong. because it's the battle is inside, is between, let's say, a materialistic view of the human being and a more spiritual view.
Fascinating. So, Brazil isn't the only country which has gone in a conservative direction in South America now. And I'm wondering, is Brazil doing anything already in this, short term so far to support some of these other countries?
We're coordinating a lot. There's something in the air of the time in South America around conservative principles and a foreign policy and a coordination that translates that. And today, the most important translation of those principles is our action regarding Venezuela,
right.
And the fact that we are Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Paraguay are very much active in pressing for real democracy in Venezuela in a total different way from what was done in the past.
How so?
Yeah, until recently, people say, well, we're supposed to be for democracy, so let's make a declaration saying we're concerned about the events in Venezuela and that we call for dialogue among the parties. Okay, let's go home. Okay. Now we really feel that we have to fight for democracy in the region, and that we have to help Venezuelan people to recover democracy. And that's not a Venezuelan issue, it's a regional and maybe global issue. The fight between democratic nations and socialist principles, socialist regimes. So it's we have the sense of duty and a sense of calling in that sort of action. And it's not only Brazil. I've been to a lot of meetings to coordinate actions on Venezuela among those countries, and you always have this electricity in the air, and people say things that you feel that are not rhetoric, that they say we have to do something, we have to act for democracy in the region. So, but the new Brazil with Bolsonaro is the game changer there, because we have the weight to transform that sort of atmosphere and to capture that energy and translate it into action. The other countries, very important, are partners, but without Brazil, and it's not because they recognize that. They were waiting for. It's interesting because the key meeting of the Lima group that coordinates on Venezuela was scheduled for January the 4th. Bolsonaro took office January the 1st, so they wanted to see what the new Brazil would look like. And we got there and we showed that we really mean what we say. We really mean that this is not a play of words. It's not to say we're concerned and call for dialogue.
Right.
Right? We want to act. There is a tendency in the region for conservative values, but it's only with Brazil, I think, that it's clearly articulated and translates into action.
Very interesting. So, China, which is definitely not a democracy, is actually also Brazil's largest trading partner, as I understand, also the largest importer of Brazilian oil. A lot of the U.S. and many other countries actually have serious security and trade concerns related to China. For example, with Huawei's involvement in the development of 5G and potential for spying and this kind of whole realm. So, how is Brazil trying to deal with this?
We really need the Chinese markets, especially for some of our agriculture sectors and mining. Our main export products to China are soybeans and iron ore. So, but by that you see that it's a relation that's very much based on raw materials.
Resource-based.
Yeah, exactly. Which is good. Many sectors are very dependent on that, and we want to keep that sort of trade. But we need to diversify it, and we need to have more access to the Chinese markets for higher-end products, so to say. We have to learn to to make the most of each relationship. And it's clear that when you want, when you talk about technological development and innovation, for example, partnerships with the United States tend to be more productive. Not to say that they cannot be productive with China. And we're basically, by the way, we're trying to work more on innovation with China and the BRICS countries. But the natural thing, because American companies that invest in Brazil, European companies as well, traditionally bring technology and they start to develop new products and innovate in Brazil. And that is essential for the country's competitiveness, for our manufacturing capacity. As much as every sector is important, but Brazil has to keep the diversity of its economy and not to concentrate too much. So what happens is that we have to develop a strategy that makes sense. And up to now, we basically, in our relationship with China, we didn't have a strategy, and China clearly has a strategy to deal with us according to their interests, which is totally fine. But Brazil has been just a country that lets things happen, and like we go with the flow, and that's something that we don't want anymore. We want to structure our relationship with China and with any other country according to our interests, according to what you can extract from different relationships. So it's a question of thinking strategically. Should be the obvious thing to do, but it was not. It was not obvious in Brazil for a long time.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, China remains an extremely important market, but you're going in with your eyes wide open.
Yes. Yes, and then technology issue that you mentioned, that's clearly maybe one of the biggest issues in the world in the next few years or now, and we have to right, and you have to study that very well and not just go with the flow, right? And not just let things happen to yourself. I mean, be an active player. That's the kind of mentality that we need to change. A mentality that Brazil is a country that cannot influence the world. We just have to take it. So, okay, oh, it's there, it's happening, let's go. Many countries, I think, have been like that for the last 15, 20 years. Not only regarding China, regarding every aspect of the United States was clearly so before Trump. It said, manage the decline. Well, the United States is declining, and there's nothing you can do about it. Let's try to do something about it. I think that's what Trump's message. The same thing in Brazil. Oh, Brazil cannot influence anything. We can. I mean, let's try. At least let's try. Maybe we can't, but I mean, let's. Coming back to that, I mean, it's natural for the human being to try things and to find. Sure. Not I mean, in the good sense of striving for things, and. Our foreign policy was a foreign policy that just took the world as it was and didn't try to interfere in anything, just copying United Nations resolutions and translating them into, I don't know, So that's basically it. So people call us fanatics or call me a fanatic. Okay, if trying to do something is to be a fanatic, let's do it. So a couple of things. First, the reason why I'm so curious about this, so the Epoch Times, we've been reporting on, let's say, Chinese influence operations for decades. Some of what Australia, for example, is seeing, kind of what has been revealed, right, with respect to how China, for example, has affected the Australian government and so forth. And we've heard that there's a lot of parliamentarians that are, taking all expense-paid trips from Huawei to China, and so we're just kind of observing that, and so it's I'm sure a lot of people will be happy to hear that Brazil is going into all this with its eyes wide open. Yeah, no, and it's again, I think that's the merit to it's something that China knows how to do, which is to explore their advantages. I mean, we should explore our advantages as well. We're not criticizing them for that. It's just we want to do things like that. But of course, if you compare the big players, China and the United States, in our market, the difference is that basically our economic relations in the case of the U.S. is with individual companies that they can have their strategies, but they have to answer to their shareholders and right and to their individual structure. So they move in a certain way. right? And they lobby, of course, but they lobby in a certain way. The Chinese, of course, is more coordinated, centrally coordinated, so they would move in a different way, a very powerful way, right? And they're right, they're protecting their interests, and we should learn how to react to that differently and how to protect our own interests.
Understood. So you were talking a little bit about, some people may describe you as maybe fanatic or something like that. The term far right has been flung around, arbitrarily. How do you respond? You don't strike me that way from our conversation today, but I'd love it if you could speak to that, to those kinds of accusations or how that's portrayed.
Yeah, no, it's the phenomenon of labeling and this approach that basically the left and cultural Marxism have developed, which is very efficient for their ends, which is to create concepts that are detached from reality. So and just to play with words, and just to throw words and then thinking that your argument is about throwing words and not dealing with. I think language is an amazing instrument to understand reality, but that's not what the left is about, or what cultural Marxism is about.
So these are unfair. You feel these are unfair accusations?
They are. Oh yeah, of course. Of course they are. So what people want when they use those things is that they want to stop the debate. Someone has certain ideas, okay, but then you call him a fascist or a racist or whatever, like here with Trump, and then traditionally you would stop the argument there.
The label is on.
Once the label is on, the ideas, no discussion. That's what people want. Those are big breakers of thought. Those words, racist, xenophobic, fascist, extreme right, all fanatic, all that, fundamentalist.
As opposed to discussing the actual policies.
And I think that's how the courageous, brave approach of President Trump is starting to break that. Because before him, someone would arrive with certain ideas about how society should work. For example, to say that, well, society must have some cohesiveness, which I think is true, and then said racist. And then, no, I'm not a racist. And then the debate would be
about that,
right? And you forget the real issue. And Trump doesn't accept that. He keeps trying to...
I think you're right about that.
Isn't it? He keeps trying to discuss the issues. And that's what we're trying to learn how to do. And people, the press, because that's what they learn. They don't know how to do anything else. They just know how to throw labels, to stop debate, to stop the debate, right? To stop discourse, to control discourse. By suffocating it. We have to learn, we're trying to learn how to keep debating and not being stopped by, because of course the natural thing when you're called a bad thing is to start looking at yourself and say, oh, what am I doing? Am I a fanatic? And then no, you cannot do that. You have to keep, okay, let's shun that and keep, no, those are my ideas. So let's discuss the ideas. Okay, let's discuss the ideas and not the words.
So a few months into President Bolsonaro's presidency, how are you able? Have you been able to create more debate where it was stifled previously?
I think so. I think we're opening the Overton window a little bit and stretching it a little bit. Things that were not in the debate are in debate now, and people would say the worst things about us, but at least they're debating the things that we think should be talked about.
Right, which is this, I guess, again, the soul of the nation, I guess, is your thesis, right?
Like that.
Yeah.
Right? So things that were not supposed to be there are there, and it's very clear, in my view, that foreign policy has never had the presence in public debate that it has now in Brazil, because of our efforts of bringing subjects that people want to discuss and that mainstream press and mainstream thought didn't want to be discussed, like those ideas, like of the nation, of the soul, of the spiritual dimension of the human being. And some people are scared. Oh, you're not supposed to talk about that, but at least those ideas start to appear. And my hope is that people one day will start really debating them. philosophically, you know, in a civilized way, and not throwing adjectives at you.
Mr. Araujo, it's such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Pleasure for me. Thank you very much for having me here.